Celestial Kian Kurt with Mrs. Maya Celestial, Mother. Raja Maureen with Haja Siti Sapur Amiruddin, grandmother, and Mrs. Joanne Raja, mother. Tudtud Amaraya Love with Mrs. Catherine Tudtud, mother. Love is also the recipient of the Best in Scouting Award for Star Scout 1. Most improved in academic performance, Farine Ashton Bryce with Mr. Francis Farine and Mrs. Hazain Michelle Farine, parents. To all honor pupils and awardees, congratulations.
Thank you, Father Disena, Mrs. Longas, and Mrs. Robles. This time, we will recognize the honor pupils and special awardees from Grade 2. They are to be presented by the Grade 2 level leader, Mrs. Maria Ruth A. Wagas. The pupils are to be awarded by the principal, Mrs. Jeneline L. Longas. Mrs. Longas is to be assisted by Mr. Richard F. Mascardo, Academic Chairman for English and Filipino subjects.
A pleasant morning. It is my privilege and honor to present to you the Grade 2 Honor Pupils and Awardees for school year 2023-2024. To begin with are the St. Augustine Awardees with high honors. Dizon Irie Feli with Mrs. Mary Grace Dizon, mother. Irie is also the recipient of the following awards: Best in Mathematics, Best in Filipino, and Best in Science and Health. Peranil Veda Shari with Miss Janilu F. Pani, aunt, and Mrs. Virginia A. Peranil, mother. Veda is also the recipient of the following awards: Best in Deportment, Best in English, and Best in Araling Panlipunan. Yusores Mia Jaydan with Miss Melody Fair Gayotin, mother. Mia is also the recipient of the Best in MAPE Award. Kaomeran Jermaine Roxette with Mr. Alan and Mrs. Barbara Kaomeran, parents. Villamor Precious Lian with Mr. Carlos and Mrs. Liz Ann Villamor, parents. Miramontes Jo, with Mrs. Jessa F. Miramontes, mother, and Mr. Jeff F. Miramontes, brother. Job is also the recipient of the Best in Christian Life Formation Award. Reyes Mia Isabella, with Mr. Ryan and Mrs. Relin Queenie Reyes, parents. Mia is also the recipient of the Best in JGCTA Club. Diaz Jamie Gabriel, with Mr. Jonathan and Mrs. Maria Gayla Diaz, parents. Jamie is also the recipient of the following awards: Best in Penmanship and Excelendia Highest Achiever Award. Montemayor Nea Ashley, with Mr. and Mrs. Anacleto Montemayor Jr., parents. Valencia Nika, with Mr. Ariel and Mrs. Gladys May Valencia, parents. Cabuenas Chris Sunday, with Police Senior Master Sergeant Domingo and Mrs. Catherine Cabuenas, parents. Dakwa Georgina Suzette, with Mr. Hennesses and Mrs. Sasha Dakwa, parents. Moving on to Saint Ezekiel Moreno awardees with honors. Las Piñas Priscilla Aisha, with Mr. Forway and Mrs. Rosario Las Piñas, parents. Destreza Louise Arthur, with Mr. Julius and Mrs. Noraliza Destreza, parents. Dampios Damian Nick, with Mr. and Mrs. Daryl Nick Dampios, parents. Escelia Kelsey Sharon Lay, with Engineer Al Stain and Dr. Richelita Estelia, parents. Cabanao Clint Sander, with Engineer Joel and Mrs. Rojit Marie Cabanao, parents. Clint is also the recipient of Best in Scouting Award. Jabal Josephine Therese, with Mrs. Josefina Monares, grandmother, and Mr. Joseph Rex O. Jabal, father. Therese is also the recipient of Best in Scouting Award. C. Alena with Mr. Clyde and Mrs. Angelica C., parents. Garces Joaquin Antonio with Mr. Glenn Anthony and Mrs. Doris Jean Garces, parents. Sedentario Sabrina Jules, Magno Angelo Castiel with Mrs. Fritzy Magno, mother. Echika Hailey Zalia with Mrs. Elizabeth Echika, mother. Pongan Julian Elise with Mr. and Mrs. Leicester Pongan, parents. Ambayik John Robert with Mrs. Jodita C. Ambayik, mother. Abarquez Stacy Piena with Mr. Boyti and Mrs. Lizelle Ann Abarquez, parents. Bacasmas Princess Kelsey with Mr. Rizber Bacasmas and Mrs. Beverlyn Badayos, parents. Bourbon Anton Philip with Mr. Marlon and Mrs. Laika Bourbon, parents. Sario Alain Rafael with Mr. Alain and Mrs. Sheila May Sario, parents. Fronda Liana with Miss Lilian Capio, mother, and Mr. Ruben Capio. Palo Kylie with Mr. John Carlo and Mrs. Irish Palo, parents. Civiliano Shea Alexandria with Miss Nicolene Cortado, mother. Estrada Zoe Rain with Mr. Irvin and Mrs. Cleope Estrada, parents. Lawas Sophia Luriz with Mrs. Maria Elaine Lawas, mother, and Mr. Mark Lawrence Lawas, brother. Pardinian Greg Alfonso Nino, with Mr. Eric Pardinian, father. Taliedo Romiza Elkina Santi, with Mr. Romualdo Jr. and Mrs. Isa Taliedo, parents. Avergonzado Yunil II, with Mr. Yunil and Mrs. May Ann Avergonzado, parents. Philosopher Sam Aubrey, with Mr. Mark Joseph and Mrs. Maria Angelina Philosopher, parents. Pagia Mary Lexi, with Mrs. Jessica Faith A. Pagia, mother. Banate Jundre, with Mrs. Maria Therese Banate, mother. Manulat Kyle Dilan, with Mr. Reynald and Mrs. Eunice Manulat, parents. Orais Sabrina Lex, with Mrs. Jessime Joy B. Orais, mother, and Miss Samantha Liz B. Orais, sister. Hernani Carl Riley, with Mr. Lexley and Mrs. Lovely Joy Hernani, parents. Habaan Athena Luis, with Mrs. Janice P. Habaan, mother. Quezon A. Rod Joseph, with Mr. Rod and Mrs. Abigail Quezon, parents. Niere Earl Mert III, with Mr. and Mrs. Earl Mert Niere, parents. Ralioma Enzo Zachary, with Mr. William Francis and Mrs. Michelle Ralioma, parents. Cabanes Eman, with Mr. Michael and Mrs. Antoinette Cabanes, parents. Ledesma Marie Francine, with Mr. Luigi Marvin and Mrs. Bea Ledesma, parents. Villarva Shije, with Mr. Patricio Jr. and Mrs. Jacqueline Villarba, parents. Tundag Grant Gavin, with Mr. Melvin and Mrs. Grace Tundag, parents. Villamin Sophia Therese, with Mrs. Lizelle and Villamin, mother. Yana Jaya Chamri, with Mr. and Mrs. Jonas A. Yana, parents. Bonghanoy Anika Sage, with Mr. RJ and Mrs. Limery Bonghanoy, parents. Moving on to the recipient of special awards. Most improved in academic performance, Incierto Skylar Bryce, with Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Blade Incierto, parents. Best in Art Explorers Club, Madali Rain Yuri. Best in Sports Club Boys, Abonitalia Jet Bugatti, with Mr. Dennis and Mrs. Maria Teresa Abonitalia, parents. To all the Grade 2 honor pupils and awardees, my heartfelt congratulations for your job well done.
Thank you, Mrs. Longos, Mr. Mascardo, and Mrs. Wagas. At this juncture, we shall award the honor pupils and special awardees from Grade 3. They are to be presented by the Grade 3 level leader, Miss Charlene C. Giral. To bestow the awards upon the pupils is Reverend Father Persius Joseph M. Desena, OAR. Father Desena is to be assisted by Mr. Joseph Rex O. Jabal, Academic Chairman for Math and Science subjects.
Adelante morning. It is my pride and honor to present to you the Grade 3 Honor Pupils and Special Awardees for the school year 2023-2024. Starting with the St. Augustine Awardees. Ibay Jaden Carlos, with Dr. Cheryl David Ibay and Mrs. Maria Antonieta Galapin, mother and aunt respectively. Jaden is also the recipient of the following awards: Best in Christian Life Formation, Best in Filipino, Best in Science and Health, and Best in MAPE. Decatoria Kalex Matthews, with Engineer Cyrus G. Decatoria and Mrs. Jovi Decatoria, parents. Kalex will also receive the following awards: Best in English and Best in Araling Panlipunan. Recamadas Paul Cyril, with Captain Cericio Recamadas and Mrs. Marcelieta Recamadas, parents. Paul will also receive the Best in Scouting for Cub Scout 3 Award. Esmeralda Zane Wayne, with Mrs. Jason Marie Esmeralda and Mr. John Esmeralda, parents. Amir Cyrus, with Mr. Dimakawa M. Salik, grandfather, and Mrs. Angie P. Salik Amir, mother. Bolton Skyla Briley, with Mr. Oliver C. Boltron and Mrs. Melissa Ann M. Boltron, parents. Ferranel Ulrich Francis, with Mrs. Virginia Ferranel, mother, and Miss Ginalu F. Panim, aunt. Ersando Mar Yuan, with Mrs. Josie Ersando, grandmother, and Mrs. Mariza Baroman, grandmother. Saint Ezekiel Moreno awardees. Haka Sir Kyle Chen, with Mr. Sergi Haka and Mrs. Lynn Haka, parents. Atilio Sabina Noel, with Mrs. Lira May Atilio and Mr. Noel Atilio, parents. Sabina will also receive the Best in Deportment Award. Azucena Danica Stacy, with Mr. Salvador Azucena Jr. and Mrs. Riza Kathrina Azucena, parents. Bernardo Ram Matthew, with Mrs. Fatima May Bernardo, mother. Ram will also receive the Best in Sports Club Award. Harb Elias Jacob Namir, with Miss Seville Cortez, mother. Binos Thea Janelle, with Mr. Archimar Binos and Mrs. Annalyn Binos, parents. Thea will also receive the Best in Scouting for Star Scouts 3 Award. Dalde Jace, with Engineer Jesse Dalde and Mrs. Ace Dalde, parents. Hakalan Mariel Shane, with Mrs. Rosemary Hakalan and Mr. Ariel Hakalan, parents. Go Michael Francis, with Mrs. Yolanda Go, mother. Lopez Sofia Athena with Mrs. Amparo B. Lopez and Mr. Samuel Akil Lopez, parents. Omayaw Andraste Jess with Mrs. Algerica B. Omayaw, mother. Taryao Kian Luis with Mr. Clint Dean Taryao and Mrs. Luisa Taryao, parents. Omangay Mary Alessa Joyce with Mr. Alexander Omangay and Mrs. Jocelyn T. Omangay, parents. Liboon Jansen Ray with Mrs. Janice Liboon and Mr. Roy Liboon, parents. Lissing Alexis Michaelin with Mr. Michael Lissing and Mrs. Alexa Lissing, parents. Alexis will also receive the Best in Art Explorers Club Award. Balakit Gladjo Mary Grace with attorney Joel Balakit and Dr. Gladys Balakit, parents. Reniva Sid Levi with Mrs. Rosa Reniva and Mr. Ivan Reniva, parents. Dangazo Marius Ravi with Dr. Cufil Dangazo and Mrs. Maria Lourdes Dangazo, parents. Cagadas Jace Christian with Mrs. Jessa Grace Cagadas, mother. Jace is also the recipient of the Best in Penmanship Award. Estelia Lexa with attorney Jess Ray Estelia and Mrs. Julieta Estelia, parents. Vidal Adriel Dawn with Mr. Alvin Vidal and Mrs. Daphne Vidal, parents. Romanilius Nino Francesco with Mrs. Josephel Ambay and Engineer Juvel Romanilius, parents. Nino is also the recipient of the Best in Mathematics Award. Holapong Ethan Mar with Mrs. Lylene V. Holapong, mother. Estelia Zofia with attorney Jess Ray Estelia and Mrs. Julieta Estelia, parents. Lim Jeron Zion with Mr. Jerson Lim and Mrs. Leyland Torre, parents. Jabal Joseph Gerard with Miss Kathy May Armasin, aunt. Impuerto John Nino with Mrs. Evelyn Impuerto, mother. Lazaga Micaela Quistis. Roma Jude Zachary with Mrs. Helena Jade Roma and Mr. Vincent Jude Roma, parents. Prejoles Savannah Tara with Mr. Nemrod Reson Prejoles, father, and Mrs. Editha Gayod, grandmother. Estela Aliana Violet with Mrs. Alma T. Estela, mother. Madrigal Kaylee with Mrs. Manilyn Madrigal and Mr. Branjolf Madrigal, parents. Celestial Kaylin Kate with Mrs. Maya Celestial, mother. Bagdok Yani Sophia with Mr. Jeffrey Bagdok and Mrs. May Sharadi Bagdok, parents. Espina Matt Erard with Mrs. Mercy Espina, mother. Gilyamak Akeles Jadel with Mrs. Lovely Joy Villamor Hernani, mother, and Mr. Lexley G. Hernani. Agaton Paulo Constancio with Mr. Ryan P. Agaton and Mrs. Maria Rose Agaton, parents. Special Achievement Awardees, Most Improved and Academic Performance, Gulie Isaiah Christoph with Mrs. Christine Jane Gulie, mother. Best in Science Club, Noel Mark Jelson with Mrs. Shona S. Noel, mother. Best in Digital Wizards Club, Sarmiento Rafaela Ina Rose with Mrs. Rose Sarmiento and Mr. Jeffrey Sarmiento, parents. Best in Sports Club for Girls, Orias Ocean Glore with Mr. Glosel Orias and Mrs. Irene Orias, parents. To all the honor pupils and special awardees, as well as to the proud parents, congratulations.
Thank you, Father Disena, Mr. Jabal, and Miss Giral. Moving on to the awarding of the honor pupils and special awardees from grade 4. They are to be presented by the grade 4 level leader, Mrs. Annalie D. Anyasco. To give the awards is Mrs. Jeneline L. Longas. To assist Mrs. Longas is Mrs. Myrna V. Beltran, academic chairperson for MAPE and Helicompt subjects.
Adelante morning, everyone. It is with great pride and honor to present to you the grade 4 honor pupils and awardees for school year 2023-2024. To begin with are the St. Augustine awardees with high honors. Estrella Alethea Fioni. Fioni is with Mrs. Selviu, mother. Fioni is also the recipient of the following awards: Best in Filipino, Best in Science and Health, Best in Araling Panipunan, and Best in Helicom. Destreza Sofia Asea Isabel. She is with Mr. Julius Destreza and Mrs. Noraliza Destreza, parents. Sofia is also received the awards in Best in CLF. Ipanto Legza. She is with attorney Dexterius John Ipanto and Mrs. Lovely Ann Ipanto, parents. Campos Zach. Zach is with Mr. and Mrs. Galbert Campos, parents. Zach is also the recipient of the following awards: Best in English and Best in MAPE. Estavilla Alain Clark. Alain is with Mr. James Arnold Estavilla and Mrs. Almira Estavilla, parents. Alain is also received the award Best in Scouting for Boy Scouts 4. Helly Emily Joy. Emily is with Mr. Dog Helly and Mrs. Jo Marie Helly, parents. Emily is also the recipient of the Best in Scouting for Girl Scouts 4. Toringan Ishi Lorraine. Lorraine is with Mrs. Anna Lu Toringan, Mr. R. Louis Toringan, parents. Next are the St. Ezekiel Moreno awardees. Lucias Kate Dominic. Kate is with Mr. Danilo Lucias Jr. and Mrs. Kirsten Iris Lucias, parents. Uraba Xavier Jake Francis. Xavier is with Mr. Aurora Celeste Uraba and Mr. Francis Uraba, parents. Xavier is also the recipient of the following awards: Best in Mathematics, Special Achievement Award, Best in Chess Club.
Delenia Christ John Kyrie. He is with Mr. Demetrio Delenia, father. Forezuelo Luke Adam. He is with Ann R. Forezuelo, mother. Ebrado Mary Chadria. Mary is with Mr. Richard Abrado, father. Hadrake Kylie Grace. She is with Mrs. Emma Hadrake and Mr. Emmanuel Hadrake, parents. Gravino Aloysius Rob. He is with Ms. Annalisa Gramido, mother. Salazar John Sebastian. John is not around today. Kugal Mark Gian is with Maria Glenda Kugal, mother. Molina Amberly Shane. Amber is with Miss Roslyn Molina, mother, and Mr. Marcelino Mosqueda, grandfather. Abonitalia Andy. Andy is with Mrs. Shrill Abonitalia and Mr. Raul Abonitalia Jr., parents. Cabal Aaron Nathaniel. Nathaniel is with Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Cabal, parents. Ligaspina Ayan Kyle. He is with Myra V. Ligaspina, mother. Pipito Bray Francis. He is with Mrs. Jessica Marie Pipito, mother, and Annabel Ruales, grandmother. Tabon Glenn Gerard. He is with attorney Glenn Tabon and Cherry Joy Cabrera, parents. Villacorta Isaac George. He is with Mr. Ian Jofer Villacorta and Mrs. Sigrid Villacorta, parents. Baclayon Alina Yue. She is with Mrs. Reina Leslie Baclayon, mother, and Mrs. Susana Onabia, grandmother. Castaño Mary Josephine. She is with Mrs. Mary Ann Castaño and Mr. Jose Castaño, parents. Henniston Paula Jane. She is with attorney Peter J. Henniston and Mrs. Joanne Henniston, parents. Paula is also received Best in deportment. Cabusas Julia Magdalene. She is with Mr. and Mrs. Gina Cabusas' parents. Bardilas Michaeli Cariz. She is with Mr. Miko Jenry Bardilas and Mrs. Chelime Bardilas' parents. Talibenyo Nicole Ann. Nicole is with Mrs. Joris Talibenyo and Mr. Homer Talibenyo, parents. Sarmiento Rafaela Jaya Ray. She is with Mrs. Rose Sarmiento and Mr. Jeff Sarmiento, parents. Tabanyag Julian Jeff. He is with Mr. Joffrey Tabanyag and Mrs. Marisol Tabanyag, parents. Tutor Zach Ashton. He is with Attorney Beverly Tutor and Mr. June Anthony Tutor, parents. Dinglaza Jairus Johan. He is with Mrs. Irene Dinglaza, mother. Anova MJ. She is with Mr. Joan Anova and Mrs. Maria Rochella Anova, parents. Chua Joaquim Paulino. He is with Mrs. Hisosa Chua Palaka and Mrs. Marilu Chua, grandmothers. Itable Gabriel Nino. He is with Mr. Herman Itable and Mrs. Merly Itable, parents. Montenegro Maria Zuri. She is with Mrs. Noreen Montenegro and Mr. Ronel Butch Montenegro, parents. Balanay Hansley Zaiki. He is with Mr. Gerald Balanay and Mrs. Marizar Balanay, parents. Ferrer Darrell Zale. He is with Mrs. Zarina Ferrer, mother. Sato Albrecht. He is with Mrs. Arcadia Sato, mother. Ceniza Carmena, Mrs. Sonia Ceniza, mother. Gohi Ashley. She's with Mrs. Breivik Josephine Ho, grandmother. Estella Stacy Amberley. She's with Engineer Athelstein Estela and Dr. Reshalita Estela Perez. Special Achievement Awards goes to Most Improved in Academic Performance, Kakela John Fox. He is with Somatra May Kakilala, mother. And lastly, we have Best in Extracurricular Activities, Hodilia Alexander Iniego. To all honor pupils and awardees, congratulations.
Thank you, Mrs. Longos, Mrs. Beltran, and Mrs. Anyasco. At this point, we are to give the awards to the honor pupils and special awardees from Grade 5. They are to be presented by the Grade 5 level leader, Mr. Marlon P. Ursando Jr. To give the awards is Reverend Father Perseus Joseph M. Desena, OAR. Father Desena is to be assisted by Miss Nonali E. Valeros, Academic Chairperson for Christian Life Formation and Araling Panlipunan subjects.
Adelante morning, everyone. It is with great pride and honor that I present the Grade 5 Honor Pupils and Awardees for the academic year 2023 to 2024 of the Elementary Department. To start with are the St. Augustine Honor Pupils with high honors. Ojales Althea Maureen Y. She is with Mr. Elizar Ojales and Mrs. Gail Ojales, parents. Althea is also the recipient of the following awards: Best in English, Best in Filipino, Best in Science and Health, Best in Araling Panlipunan, Best in MAPE, Best in Hele Computer, Best in Deportment, and Best in Extracurricular Involvement. Ipanto Lavinia Dexy P. She is with attorney Dexterius John Ipanto and Mrs. Lovely Ann Ipanto, parents. Lavinia is also the recipient of the following awards: Best in Mathematics, Best in CLF, and Best in Scouting for Junior Girl Scout 5. Balanay Harley Zachary G. He is with Mr. Gerald Balanay, father, and Mrs. Evelyn Balanay, grandmother. Harley is also the recipient of Best in Badminton Club Award. Next in line are the Saint Ezekiel Moreno Honor Pupils with honors. Bacalso Gian Lorenzo E. He is with Mr. Tom Jer Bacalso and Mrs. Cyril Bacalso, parents. Eslao Musica Ivana R. She is with Mrs. Evangeline Eslao, mother. Radaza Mary Gabriel M. She is with Mrs. Richel Radaza, mother. Escala Bria Nicole P. She is with Mrs. Mechi Escala, mother. Jorda Andre Dominic S. She is with Miss Lance Ashley Jorda, sister. Ferranil Timothy Nino A. He is with Mrs. Virginia Ferranil, mother, and Mrs. Jenelo Panim, aunt. Aquino Kyla Aneshka. She is with Miss Mary Rose Aquino, grandmother, and Miss Aisha Marie Rosaga, sister. Metante Kaylin Gracie O. She's with Mrs. Isidrita Metante, mother. Tutor Yuena Zofia I. She's with Mr. June Anthony Tutor and Attorney Beverly Tutor, parents. Meso Paul Francis S. He is with Mr. Violeto Meso and Mrs. Marilyn Meso, parents. Azucena Dylan Sebastian S. He is with Mr. Salvador Azucena Jr. and Mrs. Riza Catherina Azucena, parents. Caballero Arian Jane M. He is with Mr. and Mrs. Ariel Caballero, parents. Cathedral Elise C. She is with Mr. Willard Cathedral and Mrs. Ed Marie Ann Cathedral, parents. Gilyamak Athena Lavniel V. She is with Mr. Lexley Hernani and Mrs. Lovely Joy Hernani, parents. Gader Rich Margaret C. She is with Mr. Rostom Gader and Mrs. Michelle Gader, parents. Estavilla Alena Carmel R. She is with Mr. James Arnold and Mrs. Almira Estavilla, parents. Buscato Nathan William T. He is with Engineer Norman Buscato and Mrs. Araceli Buscato, parents. Davis Emily Jean S. She is with Mr. Charles Michael Davis and Miss Joanne Sigondino, parents. Medallia Maxine Francesca V. She is with Miss Joanna Christy Vicoy, mother, and Levi X. Xavier Medallia, brother. Carwana Amir Miguel T. He is with Mr. Christopher Ray Carwana and Mrs. Abigail Carwana, parents. Rizon Clarence Nico M. He is with Mrs. Clarinda Rizon, mother, and Clark Neil Rizon, brother. Clarence is also the recipient of Best in Photography and Cinematography Club Awards. Albarracin Jenna Marie M. She is with Mr. and Mrs. Jeff Owen Albarazin, parents. Flores Mark Jacob S. He is with Mr. Mark Ronnie Flores and Mrs. April Joy Flores, parents. Cabuenas Chris Kathleen A. She is with Police Senior Master Sergeant Domino Cabuenas and Mrs. Catherine Cabuenas, parents. Abadilia Matthew Jairus P. He is with Mr. Marlon Abadilia, father. Famulagan Zaira. She is with Mr. Tirso Palapar, father, and Miss Ivan Marie Palapar, sister. Masyas Glency Alia R. She is with Mr. Jedson Palomaria and Miss Leia Masyas, parents. Padel Zia Carley M. She is with Mrs. Jonalyn Padel, mother. Leopez Vinia Alora Zahira. She is with Miss Mary Carmel Alora Leopez, mother. Zarin Alia Yu. Fuertes James Dwayne C. He is with Mr. Janus Fuertes and Dr. Flordelisa Fuertes, parents. Perez Nathan Rafael A. She is with Mrs. Fatima Adlao, mother. Armian Shanika Jesse L. She is with Mrs. Concepcion Armian, mother, and Mr. Charles Armian, brother. Pagobo Rohan Ernesto V. He is with Mr. Ronel Pagobo and Mrs. Jocelyn Pagobo, parents. Ralioma Liam Ezekiel A. He is with Mr. William Francis and Mrs. Michelle Ralioma, parents. Anshano Samara Sadi T. She is with Mr. Jose Neil Anshano and Mrs. Ruby Anshano, parents. Hernani Gail Carmel A. She is with Mrs. Portia A. Hernani, mother. Labanta Maria Caitlin Isabel Y. Caitlin is with her mother, Miss Michelle Ibanez, and Mr. Repi Tando. Po Art Leandro D. He is with Mr. and Mrs. Anro Po, parents. Ladonga Liana Gertrude A. She is with Mrs. Leia May Ladonga, mother. Cabrera Eleanor P. She is with Mr. Emerson Cabrera, father. Ferrer Daryl Zahira C. She is with Mrs. Zarina Ferrer, mother. Chong Dendre Kian C. He is with Mr. and Mrs. Aldin Chong, parents. Katao Chaik Spencer O. He is with Mrs. Charity Katao, mother, and Miss Chanel Katao, sister. Rendon Hans Isaac A. He is with Mr. Celso Rendon and Mrs. Marietta Rendon, parents. Next in line are the recipients of the special awards in grade 5. Best in Scouting for Boy Scouts 5. Zozobrado John Vincent A. He is with Mrs. Antonia Zozobrado, mother. Most improved in academic performance, Bacalso Shialtel G. He is with Miss Olivia Raaga's aunt and Miss Mary Irene Lawrence Raaga's cousin. And best in penmanship, Montefolca Monique V. She is with Mr. Domel Montefolca and Mrs. Anisel Montefolca, parents. To all the grade 5 honor pupils, awardees, and parents, congratulations.
Thank you so much, Father Disena, Miss Valeras, and Mr. Ersando. Let us give another round of applause to the honor pupils and special awardees. At this point, may I now call on the principal, Mrs. Jeneline L. Longas, to present a special award. May we request Reverend Father Persis Joseph M. Disena, OAR, to give the award. And to assist him is Miss Nicole Nabua, Diwa Learning Integration Specialist.
A special award, the Gawad Gurong Janyo Award, is given by the Diwa Learning System Incorporated to a teacher who has exhibited the best instructional practices by integrating information and communication technology in the classroom through the use of Genio e-learning. For academic year 2023-2024, I am proud to present our Gawad Gurong Genio awardee, Mrs. Lovelyn Po, the grade 5 St. Nicholas of Tolentine Advisor. She will receive a plaque, a certificate, and a check worth 2,000 pesos. Congratulations to Madam Po.
Once again, congratulations, Mrs. Po. Our honor pupils and special awardees have reached this point of their academic pursuit with the love and support of the people who love and care for them the most, their parents and guardians. It is only fitting that in this momentous occasion, they demonstrate their gratitude to them for all they have done. Let us now give our full attention to the honor pupils and special awardees as they honor their parents and guardians. Awardees, please stand.
Maybe I'll never know the love it takes to make me a happy home that's warm and safe. And maybe you'll never see how you pray for my every need and wonder what more you could do for me. But when you walk by my side, read me stories at night, and teach me to trust in God's love. You give me a hug, maybe two, and you say I love you. Then I think you're doing enough. Maybe you wonder if you're teaching me every good thing that I can someday be. But all that I know of faith and of kindness and love and strength I've learned just by watching you every day. So when you stay by my side, hear my stories at night, and teach me to trust in God's love. You give me a hug, maybe two, and you say I love you. Then I think you're doing enough. Someday I'll have a home, a family, and I love them just as much as you love me. And maybe you'll never see you have given enough for me, a gift that will last through eternity. So when you stay by my side, hear my stories at night, and teach me to trust in God's love. You give me a hug, maybe two, and you say I love you. Then I think you're more than enough. And I am blessed every step by your love.
Thank you so much, children, for the heartwarming song tribute for your parents and guardians. I am sure they are so happy and proud of all of you. Requesting the rest of the assembly to rise for the singing of the USJ-R Alma Mater song.
For
honor pupils and special awardees continue dreaming and soaring high to fulfill your dreams. You are so blessed and you are loved. To the proud parents and guardians, congratulations. This has been Miss Cheska Altagunde saying, enjoy the rest of the day and have a memorable vacation. Adelante! Pupils, please stay for a moment for the photo shoot by grade levels. Please be seated.